She was 41 years old, alone, and down to the lining of her coat pockets when she walked to the riverbank with nothing left to lose. Her brother-in-law, Physician Calhoun, had thrown her off the family land the week after her sister died, calling her a burden the household could no longer carry. All she had left in this world was $11.40, sewn into a handkerchief, and the clothes on her back. So when the auctioneer at Miller's Landing offered the wrecked houseboat that had sat half-sunk in the shallows for 6 years, the one everyone in town called cursed, the one nobody could pull free of the mud, she paid every last cent she had for it. Folks watching from the bank laughed behind their hands and called it the most foolish purchase a desperate woman ever made. But sealed inside the rotting hull of that boat was something that would not only save her life, but would set right a wrong that had haunted an entire town for a generation. If only she had the courage to listen to what the water had been keeping quiet. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Odessa Marsh. If you're watching this from a place that feels left behind, forgotten by the world the way that old boat was forgotten by the river town that built it, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight. Odessa Marsh had been born in 1856 in a clapboard house on the bluff above the Missouri River, in the town of Carrow Bend, where her father had worked the ferry crossing for 30 years before his hands grew too stiff to hold the pole steady against the current. She was the younger of 2 daughters, and from the time she could walk, she had trailed after her father down to the water, watching him read the river the way other men read scripture, watching the color of it, the speed of the driftwood, the particular hush that came before a flood. He taught her to mend rope before she was taught to read a primer, and he taught her, too, that a thing was never truly broken so long as somebody was willing to look at it long enough to understand what it had been built for in the first place. He used to say the river never wasted anything, it only rearranged what was already there, waiting for someone patient enough to find it again. Her mother, a quiet, devout woman named Ruth, had taught both her daughters to sew and to keep a Christian household, but it was clear early on that Odessa's gifts lay elsewhere, in her hands and in her eyes, in the way she could look at a broken cart wheel or a split or and see, almost instantly, the shape of the repair. By the time she was 16, men twice her age were bringing her their tools to fix, though they were careful never to say so outside the family, for it was not considered proper work for a young woman in Carrow Bend. Her older sister, Naomi, married young and married well, or so everyone believed, taking the hand of a rising young merchant named Physician Calhoun, a man who had come up the river from St. Louis with ambitions bigger than his birth and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Odessa never trusted him, not from the first dinner he took at their table, though she could not have said exactly why, only that he watched a room the way a man watches a ledger, totaling who was worth his attention and who was not. Their father died when Odessa was 23, leaving little behind but the small house and the worn tools of his trade, and within 2 years their mother followed him, worn thin by grief and the long Missouri winters. With both parents gone, Odessa had nowhere to go but into her sister's household, into the handsome brick home Calhoun had built on the strength of his growing trade business, dealing in feed, dry goods and, though he spoke of it only vaguely, old salvage rights along the river. For nearly 15 years Odessa lived there, useful but never quite belonging, mending the household's tools and tending her sister's children, watching Calhoun's businesses swell while the rest of Carrow Bend seemed to quietly, steadily decline, as though some private prosperity of his were being drawn from a well the town itself could no longer reach. She kept her father's lessons close through all of it, that patience outlasted pride, and that nothing discarded was ever entirely worthless, only waiting for the right hands. The fall, when it came fast, the way floods on the Missouri always did, a calm morning and then the water at the door before supper. Naomi had been sick through the winter with a wasting cough that no doctor in 3 counties could name, and Odessa had nursed her through it herself, sitting up nights, boiling broths, praying the kind of plain, exhausted prayers that ask for nothing but one more morning. Naomi died in March of 1897, and Odessa had scarcely dried her own eyes before Calhoun called her into his study and told her, without much ceremony, that the household had no further place for her. He said it kindly enough, in the voice he used for difficult customers, the voice that made cruelty sound like simple arithmetic. The children were grown enough to need no further minding, he said, and a widower starting fresh could not be expected to keep his late wife's spinster sister under his roof. It would invite talk, he said, though everyone in Carrow Bend understood well enough that what he could not abide was a witness to 15 years of his small, accumulating dishonesties. He gave her 2 weeks to find lodging and $11.40, which he called a generous parting kindness, though it was less than he spent on a single supper for his business associates. Odessa took it without argument, because arguing with a man like Calhoun in a town where his money built the church roof and paid the sheriff's salary was a fight already lost before it began. She packed her father's old toolbox, the one thing Calhoun had not thought worth claiming, and walked out of the brick house with her chin level and her heart, though she would not have admitted it to a soul, entirely uncertain of what came next. She took a room above the feed store for 3 nights, paying with the last of her coins, and on the 4th morning she walked down to Miller's Landing, where the county was auctioning off abandoned property to settle old debts and clear the riverbank for a new lumber mill. Most of what stood for sale was unremarkable: old wagons, a broken-down smithy, a parcel of marshy land nobody wanted, but the last item on the auctioneer's list drew a ripple of laughter from the gathered crowd. It was the Delphine, a houseboat that had sat half-sunk in the shallows below the bend for 6 years, ever since its owner, an old riverman named Captain Aurelius Thorne, had vanished one autumn night and never been seen again. The boat had silted in, listed hard to one side, and taken on so much water that most of its lower cabins sat below the surface. Boys from town used it to dare each other onto its slanted deck, and more than one fisherman had lost a hook trying to cast near its rotted hull. The auctioneer, half joking, opened the bidding at $3, expecting no takers at all. Odessa, standing at the back of the crowd with her toolbox at her feet and her father's voice somewhere in the back of her mind telling her that nothing discarded is entirely worthless, raised her hand before she had fully decided to do it. Nobody bid against her. She paid every last cent in her handkerchief, $11.40, for a boat that the whole town agreed could never again hold itself above water, let alone hold a life. The men at the landing helped her drag it the rest of the way onto the mud bank, more out of curiosity than kindness, eager to see what foolishness she intended next, and then left her alone with it as the afternoon light slanted gold across the river. She spent that first evening simply walking its length, barefoot in the mud, running her hands along the waterlogged timber the way her father had taught her to read a wound in wood, feeling for where the rot was soft and where the old growth still held true. The Delphine was a houseboat in the old style, built broad and low for slow water, with a single cabin amidships that had once been paneled in good cherry wood, now swollen and blackened by years of river damp. Most of the lower boards near the waterline had to be condemned outright, but as she worked her way along the cabin's inner wall the second day, prying loose a warped panel that had bowed away from its frame, her fingers found something that did not belong to the boat's original construction at all. A narrow recess cut deliberately into the wall behind the panel, no wider than a man's forearm, lined with what had once been oiled canvas to keep out the damp. Inside it, wrapped in 3 layers of wax cloth gone brittle and gray with age, she found a small tin box, rusted shut, and beneath it, folded flat, a leather-bound ledger so swollen with old river moisture that its pages had fused nearly solid at the edges. She sat back on her heels in the ruined cabin with the light failing outside and understood, with a certainty she could not yet explain, that Captain Aurelius Thorne had not simply abandoned his boat 6 years before. He had hidden something inside it, and he had hidden it carefully, the way a man hides something he is either deeply ashamed of or desperately afraid someone will destroy. It took her the better part of a week, working by lamplight in the rented room above the feed store, to coax the tin box open without ruining whatever lay inside, and longer still to peel the ledger's pages apart one careful sheet at a time, using a dull knife and patience she did not know she still possessed after the grief of that spring. What she found inside the tin was not gold or any treasure of that obvious kind, but something stranger and in its way more valuable. A stack of receipts, manifests and shipping records dating back nearly 15 years, alongside a folded letter in a careful, aging hand, addressed simply, to whoever has the patience to find this. The ledger, once she'd worked it apart, proved to be Captain Thorne's own private accounting of the river trade through Carrow Bend across a decade and a half, and woven through its dry columns of cargo and freight charges was a second story entirely, written in the margins in Thorne's same careful hand, notes, dates, names. The deeper she read, the clearer it became that this was no ordinary captain's logbook, but a confession, set down by a dying man's hand for a town that had long ago stopped wondering what had happened to him, and had certainly never suspected what he'd been carrying with him the night he disappeared. The letter, once she finally dared read it whole by lamplight, told her everything the ledger only hinted at. Captain Thorne had been the river pilot most trusted by the town's grain cooperative back in the early 1880s, the man who carried Carrow Bend's harvest downriver to market each autumn and brought back the season's earnings for every farming family who'd entrusted their crop to the cooperative's hold. In the autumn of 1882, his letter confessed, a younger man new to the river trade, ambitious, persuasive, recently arrived from St. Louis, had come to him with a scheme: falsify a portion of the manifests, skim a percentage from each family's share before the earnings were ever distributed, and split the difference quietly between them, blaming any shortfall on falling grain prices or river tolls. The kind of vague excuse no farmer was positioned to dispute. Thorne, by his own unflinching account, had agreed to it for nearly 2 years, ashamed even as he wrote it down, before his conscience finally broke under the weight of watching families he'd grown up beside grow thinner each winter while his partner's fortunes climbed. He had tried to confront the man, the letter said, and been threatened. Not with violence exactly, but with ruin, with the certainty that a riverman's word would never outweigh a merchant's in any court in the county. So instead, Thorne had spent his final years secretly rebuilding his own private ledger, cross-referencing it against the cooperative's official books, gathering proof, intending to bring it all before the town once he had enough to make the case undeniable. The letter's last lines, written in a hand grown shakier than the rest, said he feared his partner had begun to suspect what he was compiling, and that he intended to hide the proof somewhere safe until he could decide how best to bring it to light without losing his own life in the doing. He never got the chance. The name he had written, again and again, in the margins of his careful, damning ledger, was Position Calhoun. Odessa sat with that name in the lamplight for a long while before she could make herself believe it, though some small, unacknowledged part of her, she realized, had perhaps always sensed something rotten beneath her brother-in-law's polish. She thought of the brick house built strong and fine while the town around it grew threadbare. She thought of the farmer she'd watched grow old and bent over diminishing harvests while Calhoun's warehouses always seemed to fill regardless of the season. She thought of Captain Thorne, a man she had known only as a boy knows a familiar face on the landing, vanishing into the dark one autumn night never to be found, while his secret sat sealed in a boat the whole town had simply written off as ruined beyond saving. She understood, turning those brittle pages, that she was holding the only surviving proof of a wrong done not just to one family but to nearly every farming household that had trusted the cooperative across 15 years, and that the man who had cast her out into the cold with $11.40 was the very same man who had been quietly bleeding the town dry the whole while. She did not act rashly. She had learned patience from a father who mended things slowly and well, and she understood that a confession alone, however damning, could be dismissed by a man as practiced at smiling away suspicion as Calhoun was, particularly when the only witness to its discovery was the spinster sister-in-law he had recently and publicly turned out of his home. So through that summer, while she finished what repairs she could manage on the Delphine and took in mending work to keep herself fed, she quietly began gathering corroboration, visiting the county courthouse to compare Thorne's old manifests against the cooperative's surviving records, several of which she found with a small grim satisfaction Calhoun had never thought to destroy because he had never imagined anyone clever enough or patient enough to come looking. She spoke carefully with a handful of the older farming families, the Pruitts and the Alawanmis and the widow Eckhart, families who had quietly wondered for years why their harvests never seemed to add up to what the river carried away, and who had simply assumed, as poor families so often must, that the fault must lie somewhere in their own ignorance of the trade rather than in the ledgers of men they trusted. Word of her questions inevitably reached Calhoun before she was ready for it to, and he came to find her himself on the muddy bank below Miller's Landing on a hot afternoon in July, standing over her wrecked, half-repaired boat with the same patient, totaling look he gave to every ledger and every person he had ever measured for his own advantage. He did not shout or threaten outright, that was never his way, but he made it plain in his calm and reasonable voice, that a woman alone, with no husband, no property beyond a worthless wreck of a boat, and no standing in a town where his name signed half the contracts and his money paid half the salaries, would find very few people willing to take her word over his, whatever old papers she imagined she'd found in a dead man's hiding place. He offered her money to leave Caro Bend quietly, a sum considerably larger than $11.40, and when she did not immediately agree, his voice cooled by degrees until the kindness in it had worn through entirely, and he reminded her, plainly now, that he could make her remaining time in this town very difficult indeed, that landlords and shopkeepers listened to men like him long before they listened to women like her. Odessa stood her ground on the muddy bank with her father's old toolbox at her feet and the captain's ledger locked safe in a strong box she'd bought with her first mending wages, and she told him, in a voice steadier than she felt, that she had not spent 15 years in his household learning nothing about the particular sound a man makes when he is frightened and trying very hard not to show it. He left without another word, but she understood she had perhaps a matter of days, not weeks, before he moved to discredit her, or worse, to make the evidence disappear the way he had once hoped Captain Thorne himself might simply disappear and be forgotten. She worked through the next 3 nights with little sleep, copying the most damning pages of the ledger by hand in case the original should ever be lost or stolen, and on the 4th day she did not go to the sheriff, whose salary she knew well enough came partly from Calhoun's pocket, but instead to the one man in Caro Bend whose integrity even Calhoun had never managed to purchase. the circuit judge, Elias Worthing, who came through the county only twice a year but whose name carried weight enough to call a proper hearing. She brought with her not only the ledger and the letter but 5 of the old farming families themselves, the Pruitts and the Alawanmis and the widow Eckhart among them, each carrying whatever scraps of their own old harvest records they had kept tucked away in family Bibles and tin boxes of their own, the small private suspicions of 15 years finally given a place to be spoken aloud together rather than carried alone. Calhoun, when summoned, tried first denial, then condescension, suggesting the court not waste its time on the fading scribbles of a drunken riverman who'd likely run off owing debts of his own, but Judge Worthing was a careful reader, and the arithmetic in Thorne's ledger, set patiently beside the cooperative's surviving books, did not lie the way men sometimes could. Within the month, the truth had unraveled the whole careful structure Calhoun had built across 15 years. The warehouses mortgaged twice over, the dry goods business propped up entirely by money that had never been his to keep, and a string of smaller debts called due all at once now that his good name, the only collateral that had ever truly secured them, had come apart in open court. He did not go to prison. The law in that place and time was not built to be especially hard on a white merchant of his standing, but he lost the brick house, the warehouses and every contract his name had once guaranteed, and he left Caro Bend within the year a diminished man, owing more than he could ever repay, his particular kind of quiet, totaling cruelty finally rendered powerless in a town that no longer trusted his arithmetic. What mattered far more to Odessa than Calhoun's ruin, though she would admit to a private, complicated satisfaction in it, was what came after. The court ordered what restitution could still be recovered from Calhoun's remaining assets distributed back among the farming families he had defrauded, a sum modest by any city's standard but enough, that hard winter, to mean seed corn and mended roofs and a doctor's visit that might otherwise have gone unpaid. The grain cooperative itself, shamed into reckoning with 15 years of negligence, voted to name Odessa Marsh its independent auditor, a position invented largely because nobody else in the county had demonstrated either her patience or her nerve, and one that paid her, for the first time in her life, a wage entirely her own. She used part of her first year's earnings, fittingly, to finish what she'd started on the muddy bank below Miller's Landing, not to sell the Delphine as several buyers now eagerly offered to purchase the boat that had made her famous up and down the river, but to repair it fully, plank by plank, the way her father had taught her, until it sat level and sound on the water for the first time in nearly a decade. She kept Captain Thorne's cabin paneling, what could be saved of it, polished and intact, and beneath it, in the very recess where his confession had waited 6 long years for someone patient enough to find it, she placed a small brass plaque bearing his name and the dates of his service to the river trade, so that the truth he'd died trying to tell would never again need hiding in the dark. Caro Bend remembers it now as the year the river finally settled its old debts, though most who tell the story simplify it down to the bones. A woman with nothing, a boat nobody wanted, and a secret that set things right. But it began, as we told you, with a 41-year-old woman cast out into the cold with $11.40, and a wrecked houseboat the whole town swore could never again hold itself above water. Odessa Marsh proved, in the end, that what the world calls ruined and what is truly beyond saving are very rarely the same thing, and that patience, the slow, unglamorous patience of someone willing to look at a broken thing long enough to understand what it was built for, can recover a buried truth just as surely as it can recover a length of good cherry wood from beneath the river's silt. She lived another 30 years along that same stretch of water, never remarrying, never needing to. Her name eventually lent to the very landing where she'd once stood with her father's toolbox at her feet and nothing left to lose, and travelers passing through Caro Bend even now will hear, if they ask the right person, the story of the boat nobody could salvage, and the woman who proved them wrong. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of Odessa's story tonight. If her patience and her quiet refusal to let anyone's contempt define what she was worth moved you even a little, we'd be grateful if you'd share this story with someone who might need to hear it, and we always love reading your thoughts in the comments below. So tell us tonight, is there a time in your own life when you found real value in something the world around you had already written off as ruined? We read every story you leave us and we treasure them. Until next time, stay close.